Hello, bio students. Today we are looking at lesson 2, macromolecules, within our biochemistry unit. So I want to focus first on this prefix macro. So what do you think that means? What do you think macro means? Well, macro means large or big. So we're going to talk about molecules that are larger than your typical molecules in the human body. And we're going to be talking about molecules that play a very important role in the human body. So let's start with this warm-up, and let's see if you guys remember some of these things. So can you list the parts of the cell theory? Do you remember the role that water plays in a cell? And can you name 3 substances that can pass through the cell membrane into or out of the cell? So pause the video and see if you know the answers to these questions. Okay, so do you remember? I hope so. So, parts of the cell theory, if you remember, there are 3 main parts to the cell theory. All living things are made up of cells. Cells are the basic unit of life, and new cells come from the division of existing or pre-existing cells. Now, we also know that metabolism, or chemical reactions, happen within cells. We also know that DNA found in the nucleus is passed from one cell to another. And we know that all cells have pretty much the same basic composition, although there are some differences, as you can see here. So here we see a red blood cell. It is very atypical. And here we see some muscle cells that have many nuclei. And here we see a nerve cell that also looks atypical in comparison to other cells. Here we see a plant cell, a diatom, and a paramecium, which are protists. So what role does water play in cells? We know we need water. Water is essential for life because it forms the cytoplasm. It supports the organelles. It also acts as a solvent. That means that it can dissolve polar substances like itself and ionic compounds like, for example, salt. We know that water absorbs heat, therefore it's a coolant. And we know that water has a high specific heat, so it's hard to change the temperature of water. 3 substances that can pass through the cell membrane into or out of the cell, and these are substances that are small in size, be oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, ions, which are electrically charged particles, and glucose. All right, so moving on to the first slide here. We need to understand that all cells have the same basic composition, and that's because they all share pretty much the same elements and certain chemical reactions that happen within those cells. Now, we need to be able to differentiate between the most abundant elements and then elements that are not as abundant, so are found in the body in less proportion and less percentages here. So I like to think of the mnemonic CHOMPS, and CHOMPS is what helps me remember the most abundant elements in living things: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. But there are other elements in the human body that perhaps are not as common, and maybe you don't know what their functions are. So for example, these are calcium to help form bones, potassium to regulate muscle contraction and nerve signals. Potassium usually works with sodium to do this, and this is called the sodium-potassium pump. And then sometimes you get sodium chloride, NaCl, from the salts that you eat, and sometimes this chlorine is in the form of an ion known as chloride, and we absorb this and digest it, and then it goes straight into our tissues and skeletons and blood, and it allows for electrical neutrality and pressure in extracellular fluids. And magnesium, for example, is also a very important cofactor in enzyme activity or biochemical reactions, and you can find it in different processes like protein synthesis or muscle and nerve function. And these substances, even though they're found in smaller quantities, these are important, and we call these electrolytes. So electrolytes are elements that are going to allow us to keep a good homeostatic control within our tissues and our cells. And sometimes we find ourselves, when we're dehydrated, that we lose some of these electrolytes. So then we need to eat and drink and regain these electrolytes again. And you might have heard of Pedialyte. You might have had those when you were young. And this is a drink that's full of these electrolytes. Or perhaps Gatorade, which is also full of electrolytes, and hence the reason why you might need to drink some Gatorade after a very long workout. Just got to watch out for the sugar content, though, because Gatorade has a lot of sugar, and that's bad. So macromolecules are carbon-based. Now, we are carbon organisms. And if we look at our previous slide here, we see that 18.5% of our body is carbon. So we definitely need carbon. Carbon is very important in our bodies. We are carbon-based organisms. Now, we need to understand some of the structures and forms of carbon and a little bit about the properties of carbon. So carbon can form up to 4 covalent bonds because it has 4 valence electrons. Now, you're going to learn a little bit more about this in chemistry, but if you look at carbon in the periodic table, you're going to see that it's atomic number 6. So that means that if you have the carbon atom right here, right, on the outside it's going to have these electrons. So you're going to learn that there are these orbitals outside the carbon atom, and these electrons kind of assemble themselves around the atom. So on the first shell, or cloud as we call them, you're going to find 2 electrons. And then on the second shell or cloud, you're going to find 4 electrons. And if you count, that's a total of 6 electrons, right? So notice how on the outer orbital or shell here, or clouds, as we also call them, there are 4 electrons. So we call those 4 electrons valence electrons because they are on the outer most portion. So that means that these 4 valence electrons can form bonds, and the bonds that they form are covalent bonds. Now, a covalent bond means that these electrons on the outer portion of the atom are going to be shared with another atom. So here you see that that carbon loves to form covalent bonds with hydrogen. So it shares one of its electrons, and it can form a covalent bond with hydrogen or with another carbon atom. So then that means that the carbon-based molecules can have different arrangements. So you see here that some can be a straight chain like this, some can be a branched chain like this, and some can also form a ring like this. And we're going to look at how glucose, which is one of our major molecules here, is a ring structure, or can be a ring structure. Okay, so moving on, macromolecules are polymers. So that means that macromolecules are made up of many tiny monomers. So we're going to focus in this picture in just a moment, but what happens when you consume or you eat something? So you eat it, it goes into your digestive system, and you break it down into smaller pieces. These smaller pieces are called monomers. So a monomer is a subunit or a smaller piece, and then when you put those smaller pieces together, kind of like putting pieces of a puzzle together, you get a polymer. So a polymer is a molecule made up of multiple monomers. So a macromolecule is a polymer, is made up of multiple monomers, right? So when you eat and you break down these smaller pieces, you're going to take these smaller pieces, these monomers, like sugars, and you're going to use them for cellular use, what we call your metabolism. You're going to use that energy for growth and repair, reproduction, gas exchange, metabolism, and response. And sometimes you got to go the other way, right? Sometimes you have to take, you take smaller pieces and you put them together into a bigger piece, and that's going to require energy. So There are different metabolic pathways. We have an anabolic pathway and we have a catabolic pathway. So in an anabolic pathway, you take the individual monomers, so the individual pieces like this. You need energy to put these little pieces together, and then you form a polymer. And notice that this polymer has to be bonded one way or another, right? These smaller pieces need to be bonded or holding hands one way or another. In a catabolic reaction, you take a large molecule, so you take a polymer like this, and you break it down into smaller pieces, or you break it down into monomers. So in that process, energy is released. So in your note taker, you are to give some examples of anabolic and catabolic reactions. So as we go through the next slides, see if you can find some examples of anabolic and catabolic reactions. So there are 4 types of macromolecules that we're going to be looking at in this particular lesson. So remember that this unit is called biochemistry because these are molecules that we need in our body to function. So it's part of our biology. But we're also looking at the chemistry of these molecules. What do they look like at the elemental level? What do they look like at the compound level? So first I'm just going to list the 4 major types of macromolecules in our body. The first one is carbohydrate, and these are in no particular order. The second one is lipids. The third one is a protein, and the fourth one is a nucleic acid. So these macromolecules, remember I told you, are made up of individual monomers, and these macromolecules are polymers. So a carbohydrate is a polymer of many tiny glucose molecules. So we think of a carbohydrate as a let me delete that here. We think of a carbohydrate as a poly, which means many, saccharide, which means sugar. So you put many sugars together, you put many monomers of sugars together, and you get a polymer. And this polymer is called a polysaccharide. And this polysaccharide happens to be a carbohydrate. Now, what is the monomer that makes up this polymer? Well, the monomer is a sugar. The monomer, in this particular case, is a monosaccharide. So mono means one, saccharide means sugar. So an example of this monomer, an example of this monosaccharide is glucose, which is a simple sugar. So if we take many sugars together and we put them together in an anabolic reaction, then we get a polymer, or we might get a disaccharide or a dimer of 2 monomers together. So we'll explore these in just a moment. So a carbohydrate is made up of 3 major elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So make sure you write that down as well. And carbohydrates provide fast energy to the cell. And carbohydrates in plants also form cell walls of plants and fungi. Now, this is a picture of glucose, which is the monomer that makes up this polymer or this polysaccharide. Now, if you look at glucose likes to form this ring structure. And if you see the ring structure, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. So then that means that glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. So the formula for glucose, and this is probably important for you to write down in your notes, it's C6 because it's got 6 carbons, H12 because if you count the hydrogens, it's got 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So this ratio is of carbon, hydrogens, and oxygen is pretty common in these carbohydrates. So we see a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in carbohydrates. Now, these carbohydrates provide fast energy to the cell. So that means that you might have heard of the term pasta loading. So you might have heard of a football team, a couple of hours before a game, they eat lots of carbs, right? They eat lots of pasta because that's going to provide fast energy to the cell. And you're going to need that if you're about to play a football game. So here we see many examples of polysaccharides. So cellulose, starch found in potatoes, glycogen found in muscle, or chitin found in exoskeletons of different organisms are made up of this polysaccharide. So notice that a polysaccharide is individual monomers of glucose, as you see here. And they're all holding hands and they're all held together by a bond. This bond is called a glycosidic bond, but that's probably more than you need to know. Now, sometimes the glucose here and the glucose here, sometimes the glucose here and another type of monomer called fructose might form a compound known as sucrose. Now, this sucrose, or table sugar, is just made up of 2 monomers. So we call this a disaccharide. And sometimes glucose is going to form a bond with galactose and form lactose. And you might have heard of lactose because it's found in milk. So all of these are sugars, all of these are carbohydrates. Okay, moving on. So the second type of macromolecule that we're going to look at are the lipids. So lipids are also polymers. So a lipid, or a chain of monomer, is usually a big molecule, right? So the monomers, or the individual subunits that make up lipids, are fatty acid tails and a glycerol head. So if you look in the picture here, this is what a free fatty acid tail looks like, and this is what a glycerol head looks like. Sometimes these free fatty acids combine with the glycerol head, and for example, they might form a more complex lipid known as a triglyceride. You might have heard of triglycerides because they're found in fatty foods, and we need to watch our levels of triglycerides in the foods that we eat because they can sometimes block the flow of blood in our arteries. So the elements found in lipids are in bigger proportions are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, so it's also CHO. It's not in the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio as in carbohydrates. And we know that lipids provide a long-term energy function. So that's why these lipids, or we can sometimes call them fats, an example of a lipid is fat, right? They need to get stored. And they're stored in fat cells, and when needed, they will provide that long-term energy. We also know that these lipids insulate or hold in heat. So if you think of a polar bear, right, it's got lots of fat, and it's an insulation, but they also form cell membranes. So when we think of a phospholipid, okay, which is this guy right here, if you remember in the composition of cell membranes, a phospholipid is a type of lipid. Now, one last thing that I just want to point out is that there's good fats and bad fats. So there's saturated fats, and then there are unsaturated fats. So the saturated fats are the bad fats, and this is because they remain solid at room temperature. So think of these fats coming from animal fats, and because they remain solid at room temperature, they can cause blockage in your arteries. And that could lead to many bad things like high blood pressure or heart attacks. So if they solidify right within your arteries and form plaque. So these saturated fats that remain solid at room temperature come from animal fat. So we're talking bacon, we're talking butter, right? So you need to watch out the types of saturated fats that you eat. Now, unsaturated fats, they remain liquid at room temperature, and they come from plant fats. So when we think of avocados, when we think of nuts, those are the good types of unsaturated fats. All right, moving on. So the third type of macromolecule that we're going to look at is a protein. So proteins are going to become very important in our following unit in molecular biology, so make sure you pay attention. So proteins are also polymers. That means that they're made up of individual monomers. Now the individual monomer that makes up a protein is called an amino acid. Now it's called an amino acid because it's got one portion here that is made up of an amine group, and then it has one portion here that's made up of a carboxylic acid group. So if you put that together, you call it an amino acid. So an amino acid, if you look at this picture here, has a particular structure that can sometimes vary. There is a variable group here that varies, but the amine group and the carboxylic acid group here on the carbon chain remains the same. So if you look at the monomer, you see that the major types of elements that are found are CHON, or CHON. So when we think of proteins, we think of CHON. Okay, these are the elements. Now, there are about 20 common amino acids that make up proteins. So like I said, we're going to be looking at these different common amino acids. Not common proteins, but common amino acids that make up proteins. And we're going to be looking at how proteins are made in the molecular biology unit. So what is the function of proteins? Well, there's so many, right? I could go on forever here listing protein functions. Proteins are found everywhere in our body. They form enzymes that speed up chemical reactions. They aid in movement and support found in your muscles, your hair, your nails. They form antibodies. That means they're part of your immune system to fight disease. They transport material through cell membrane and throughout the body. And these proteins are initially coded by your DNA, which sends a message and says, these are the proteins that are needed in certain cells of your body. Now, there's different structures here, as you can see, for proteins, and depending on the structure that it has, that's probably going to dictate the function of that particular protein. Usually a primary structural protein has no real function. It's not until you get into a secondary, perhaps helical or beta-pleated sheet structure, that you start seeing some structural support function. Tertiary structure, these are three-dimensional structures, for example, in enzymes with catalytic activity properties. And then a quaternary structure, which is made up of many different tertiary structures. And for example, hemoglobin, which is found in red blood cells, is a quaternary structure, and it allows for the transport of oxygen in your blood. Okay, moving on, we have nucleic acids. And again, in our next unit of molecular biology, we're going to be looking at this fourth type of macromolecule in lots of detail. Now, nucleic acids are polymers, and they are made up of individual nucleotides. So a nucleotide has three parts: a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. And here you see a picture of the nucleotide. So this is the nucleotide. This whole thing is the nucleotide, okay? And you see that it has a phosphate, and that it has a sugar, and that it has a base. So I like to remind my students of there's always a mnemonic for everything. So PBS is the mnemonic for remembering the parts of the nucleotide. So when we put many different nucleotides together. So here's one. Okay, here's one nucleotide. And then if we put another nucleotide together, here's another one. And then if we put another nucleotide together, here's another one. And notice that the base can change, right? And when we study DNA and RNA later in the next unit, we're going to see that the base here can change, but the phosphate sugar backbone remains the same. So when we put these nucleotides together, we can perhaps get a nucleic acid like RNA. And this could be RNA because it has U, right, if it's single-stranded. Or we can get a nucleic acid like DNA. Okay, remember, these are the two types of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. So DNA is double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded. But if you notice, there's the nucleotide, right? All made up of nucleotides. So the elements that are found in these molecules are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So we think of chomps. So we went from cho to chon to now chomp. All right, so what is the function of nucleic acids? Well, they provide instructions for building proteins because we know the central dogma of biology is that DNA makes RNA, and then RNA carries the instructions to proteins, and then the proteins are the ones that are going to pretty much be in charge of every cellular job in our body. But DNA and RNA, they kind of direct the functions of the cell. They store the genetic information, right? So that then our proteins, we kind of think of them as the workers, can go about and do the job that DNA and RNA are dictating them to do. Okay, so those are the 4 different types of macromolecules. So were you able to think of examples of catabolic and anabolic reactions? So anytime you break a carbohydrate into a monosaccharide or a disaccharide, that's a catabolic reaction. But if you go the other way, right, if you take a disaccharide, for example, that's 2 sugars, and you break them down into the individual monomers, then that's anabolism. So here we see a picture. The food that we eat, or bigger molecules, right, are broken down into smaller molecules. So that's a catabolic reaction. And then when we take those individual components and we put them together, that's anabolism. So here we see that the foods that we eat carry these macromolecules, right? And that we break down these macromolecules in our body as we digest it and as we absorb it into our body and our blood. Something to point out here is that these amino acids and nucleotides that break down, sometimes the nitrogen-containing compounds here can be a little bit toxic in our body. So that's why our kidneys make sure to filter our blood and release all of these excess nitrogen-containing compounds in the form of urine or urea. So we need these macromolecules, right? We need them to construct the molecules for growth and repair. DNA instructs the cell to make proteins. These monomers can be broken down during metabolism so that we can respond to stimuli. Monosaccharides like glucose are broken down to make ATP in cellular respiration. Lipids are stored later for energy use or broken down for energy. DNA can be synthesized before cell division. And, for example, if nucleotides are added to existing templates to create 2 identical DNA strands. This is one way that DNA is made, and we're going to talk about later in the next unit. Okay, so just a quick review here. Remember that carbon cycles, right? And carbon cycles through the atmosphere and the air, carbon dioxide. It cycles in the water, in the geosphere, and in the biosphere. So carbon is everywhere. We release it as part of cellular respiration. Plants release it as part of cellular respiration. Animals release it as part of cellular respiration. And then the CO2 is taken up by plants in the process known as photosynthesis. And final thought, remember that we have the different types of macromolecules. There are 4 different types of macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And remember their main element composition, right? Cho, Chan, and Chomp. All right, guys, that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video.